We now turn to looking at Aristotle's habit and virtue. The background for Aristotle remains the same from part 2, so I won't repeat that here. Now Aristotle begins, at least in the section we're looking at, with a consideration of the origin and nature of virtue. And he begins, sensibly enough, by considering human nature. Now, as Aristotle sees it, moral virtues are neither by nature, so not inherently good, nor contrary to nature, but he believes it is natural to receive virtue. So, put roughly, we're born morally neutral in general. We are neither born inherently virtuous or inherently viceful. It's natural for us to become virtuous, but the way we develop them is due to habit. Now, in the case of our natural faculties, things like sight, hearing, taste, etc., we have them before we use them. We don't acquire sight through use or hearing through use. We have them. Now, virtues, though, work differently. As Aristotle sees it, we acquire them by exercising them. And he draws an analogy to the arts here. And he claims, to go with the analogy, that the way we become builders is by building. The way someone becomes a guitar player is by playing guitar. The way someone becomes a runner is by running. And likewise, by analogy reasons, that a person becomes just by performing just actions. A person becomes temperate by performing temperate actions. A person becomes brave by performing brave actions. And so essentially the way we acquire these virtues is by acting in the appropriate way. Now Aristotle gives a hint of what he develops in much more detail later. Now, this relates to the question of who is supposed to be the moral educator. Now, Aristotle takes it to be the state. So, he claims that in a good state, the legislators, those creating the laws, are supposed to make the citizens good by habituation. And this is the intent of the legislator, at least according to Aristotle. And if they fail in it, then they fail in what their true purpose is. Now, he does recognize, of course, that not all legislators do what they're supposed to do. And he takes that to distinguish between a good constitution of a state and a bad one. So what a state is supposed to do is pass laws and engage its citizenry in such a way that they become virtuous. So the state is supposed to be the moral educator. And we'll see more of this in the final part of habit and virtue. Now he returns back to his analogy with learning crafts, and he notes that the causes that bring out an excellence in a craft are the same one that destroys it. So, taking the example of a guitar, one becomes a good guitar player by playing guitar, and one becomes a bad guitar player by playing guitar. And he claims the same applies to everyone else in all terms of all crafts. And his proof for this is basically that, if there was no need to teach people, people would simply be born good at doing things like playing guitar, or math, or coding web pages, or being an architect, or bad at it. But of course, as Aristotle notes, people are born with potentials, but they become good at what they do or bad at what they do by doing it. And so he sticks with the same analogy. Now he takes again this analogy to hold, that learning virtues is the same as learning a craft essentially. So how we deal with others makes us just or unjust. How we act when we face danger makes us brave or cowardly. And sort of the central thing of how this works, like activities produce like dispositions. So roughly put, we are what we do. And he believes that the habits that we form from the earliest age make all the difference in the world. Now, here he goes to talk about something we saw earlier in part 2, namely the question about what is the actual science of ethics. Now, as we saw back in part 2, looking at his virtue theory in general, he still holds the same view, namely that ethics is a practical science. So, being a practical science, a great deal depends on the particulars. And so you can only give general rules, as opposed to very particular rules. Now, he regards ethics as being not theoretical. Unlike other branches of philosophy, It's not about the theory, it's about the practice. And in a very appropriate quote, he says, "We are studying not to know goodness, but how to become good men." And his view is, otherwise it would be useless. To use an analogy, not one used by Aristotle, but to sort of illustrate it, you can think about the example of driver's ed. If you go to take driver's ed, your object is to learn how to drive. And so if you went in and the first class involved learning, say, the theory of physics involving motion, and then another class involved, say, the engineering of the internal combustion engine, another class involved, say, history of Henry Ford, the development of automobiles. Now that may all be well and interesting, but of course, as a driver's ed class, it would be useless, because what you need to do is learn how to drive. And Aristotle regards ethics in a very similar way. He's not claiming that the theoretical stuff is completely without point, but his view is that the goal is to become good. That is the objective. And he assumes, as sort of his assumption for the discussion, that what we should do is act in accord with right principle. Now again, he notes that he can't give a precise, detailed account of how we should conduct ourselves, because he draws an analogy to help, that questions of conduct are as little fixed as what is healthful. And so applying his approach to particular problems doesn't allow a great deal of precision. And so, as he claims, a person must think out at each step what the circumstances demand. And to support this, he draws an analogy to medicine and also to navigation. Now, going with the medicine analogy, when one is engaged in the practice of medicine, one has certain guidelines in terms of what is learned in biology, pharmacy, and so forth. But of course, a doctor just can't simply go in and just apply generic treatments to everyone. What they have to do is work on that particular circumstance. Likewise with navigation. Back before people had GPS that could just guide them around, navigation involved proceeding from point to point, looking for landmarks, and then eventually looking at the stars and guiding oneself through the particular circumstances in that situation. And so he takes a similar view to ethics, that one cannot have really specific rules, one must just have general rules. Now, in terms of what should be taught, not surprisingly, given this is Aristotle, he essentially focuses on his own theory, namely virtue theory. And his view is, of course, that his cardinal rule, his main rule, is that doing right conduct, is incompatible with excess or deficiency. In other words, going back to what we saw in part 2 of virtue theory, it's a recap of the Goldilocks theory of ethics, as I kind of crudely put it. Namely, that it should not be too much, excess, or too little, deficiency. It needs to be just right. Now he draws yet another analogy to health. And he notes that, like health, which can be destroyed by excess and deficiency, the same is true of moral qualities. Going back to health, excessive exercise, interesting enough, can be harmful. Exercising too much can tire a person out, injure their muscles, etc. And insufficient exercise obviously is not good for one's health either, so too much or too little is bad. Likewise, he says, eating and drinking too much is harmful to health. And of course, eating and drinking too little is also bad for health. And the right amount, obviously enough, gets things just right. And he says the same holds true in the case of virtue, that, to take an example, a person who fears everything becomes a coward. A person who's afraid of nothing becomes foolhardy. A person who indulges in every pleasure without restraint becomes licentious. And so, as he sees it, these virtues, like temperance and courage, are destroyed by excess, too much, and deficiency, too little, and they are preserved by the mean. Again, the Goldilocks theory of ethics. What one should seek is the just right. Avoid the too much, the too little, and get the just right. And so these virtues, for him, are developed by the same actions that give rise to them. So the way one becomes, for example, during his analogy to health, Physical strength comes from proper nourishment and severe training. Likewise, one becomes temperate by refraining from pleasures, and someone who's temperate is most able to abstain from these pleasures. The way to become brave for Aristotle is to face alarming situations, and the brave, of course, are better able to handle them. So he sees it, we become what we are by what we do.